Hello, I'm Mark Galeotti. It's Thursday, the 13th of June 2024, and today the book I co-wrote with Anna Arutunyan, Downfall, Prigozhin, Putin and the New Fight for the Future of Russia, is published in the UK by Ebury, an imprint of Penguin Random House. I think it comes out in the United States in September, but it is available for pre-order. And what I wanted to do today is just basically give you 4 reasons why I would hope that you would want to read and indeed find this book of interest. First of all, this is not about, for example, his Wagner mercenary organisation. There's some very good books on that still to come out. Nor is it specifically about the troll farms that he ran, though obviously it does, of course, detail all of those. Instead, this is specifically about Prigozhin himself and the way this fascinating, although clearly deeply unpleasant man, his life in so many ways mirrors and demonstrates something about the trajectory of modern Russia and particularly the Putin era. And so we have dragged together a whole variety of details about his life, quite how he built himself up to this position, which is not always easy. I mean, this is a man who, on the one hand, very carefully built his own public persona, but also jealously guarded his private one. So much so that, for example, one journalist who actually just wanted to do a sort of standard profile contacted his press people and they warned her off in no uncertain terms. And when she pushed and just said, look, it's a very vanilla kind of profile we want to run, they warned her that if she went ahead, her car would be driven off the road and she herself will be dragged off into a forest and raped. Nice chap, which also helps explain why people are rather more willing to talk about Prigozhin now that he's safely dead. So anyway, as I said, this is about following his life through and all the various stages, and in some ways the particular aspects of Russian history that he was a witness or indeed a part of. So, second point, this is also very much a story about those kind of wild beginnings of the new Russia. It's interesting that Prigozhin, for different reasons, much like Putin, actually missed the optimistic, enthusiastic early years of Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika. Putin was off in Dresden doing his KGB stuff. Prigozhin was in prison. And incidentally, in prison he actually set up a business, which says something about his entrepreneurial abilities and the very fact that he was able to broker the necessary deals with both corrupt prison authorities and also the criminal gang authorities who basically run the prison camp in question from the inside. But anyway, he comes out in 1990 just as basically the Soviet Union is in collapse, ready for this kind of wild East capitalism of the 1990s, in which his particular blend of genuine entrepreneurialism, capacity to use and threaten violence, and capacity to make deals, particularly with important people who are going to be useful, is so important. So again, understanding Prigozhin's trajectory from a guy who starts selling second-hand cars and running some hot dog stands, which actually is a much bigger deal than one might think, as we talk about in the book, all the way through to setting up restaurants, doing real estate deals, basically building a whole corporate conglomerate, handling all kinds of different activities before he moves into things like the troll farms and the like. That is in many ways a story of the emergence of the kind of rough capitalism of what becomes Putin's Russia, and also the emergence of a new elite, because his restaurants in St. Petersburg ironically become the cradle of a so-called tusovka, a kind of a gathering of people who come together and essentially form what will be the basis of the Putin-era elite at the time. So, actually one finds that one of the key places where they all came together were in Prigozhin's restaurants. And that leads into the third issue. I mean, this is also a story of adhocracy, which is how certainly I like to think of Putin's regime. In many ways, Putin's Russia is a strange beast. It's a modern, bureaucratic, institutionalized state with a medieval court sitting on top of it, in which actually the greatest currency is the favour of the president, the Tsar in effect, and in which actually your real role may well have little to do with your formal one. Whether you're a government minister, whether you're an oligarch, at any point you can be pressed into service to do something else. And in fact, especially if you're one of the sort of not quite so powerful figures, And let's be honest, Prigozhin was never a friend of Putin's. He was a useful contact, nothing more. Putin actually, at least a couple of times, made a point of publicly humiliating Prigozhin just to make the point that this is not someone who's right in my personal circle of friends. But anyway, if you are in that aspirant, rising, but also precarious collection of people, and Prigozhin was a minigarch, not an oligarch, you're also trying to predict what the boss is going to want tomorrow and provide that today. This is very much one of Prigozhin's skills. So as an adhocrat, his story is one that actually illustrates how Putin's regime really works, how you actually manage to have a medieval-style personalistic court coexisting with all the sort of trappings of a modern state. And even, I mean, we looked into this in a lot of detail, and we couldn't ever come up with an absolute convinced, definite, here is the paperwork to show it. But it seems pretty clear, for example, that Prigozhin did not want to actually become a mercenary condottiere. He didn't want to run Wagner. He was making a lot of money as was. He was looking, in fact, to sort of snap up some new businesses in the rebellious and increasingly Russian-controlled Donbass in 2014 instead. But the Kremlin ultimately decided that they wanted a mercenary force as a deniable instrument, not originally in Ukraine, but elsewhere, maybe in Africa and Latin America and the like. And they decided that Prigozhin had the right kind of mix of skills to be the person that they wanted to front it. And at first, Prigozhin doesn't seem to have been at all enthused by the idea. But the point is, his whole business model depended on essentially Kremlin favour, for sweetheart contracts, for the fact that certain breaches of procedure, protocol and outright law got overlooked, that kind of thing. And he knew perfectly well that what the Kremlin gives today, it can take away tomorrow. So basically, he got into the mercenarying business. So in this respect, this is what happens in an adhocracy. It depends on people like Prigozhin, and there's a lot of them, even though not perhaps quite so larger than life in all the worst possible ways. But anyway, people like Prigozhin are vital for the Putin regime. And on the whole, it tends to use them, elevate them, and then quite possibly then dispose of them when they're no longer useful. And that leads me on to the fourth and the last point I want to make, which is Prigozhin's role as a rebel. This man whose whole career was dependent upon Putin and Putin's state, apparently turning against it. Of course, he wasn't truly turning against it. When he mutinied in 2023, something that actually is worth noting, happened 2 weeks after we had signed the contract to write this book. So that was like a moment when I think, is that making it easier, harder, whatever? Anyway, when he mutinied, it was not to topple Putin. We need to stress that. It was to try and persuade Putin to, in some ways, renegotiate the relationship between him, Prigozhin, and Defense Minister Shoigu. It was a performative act more than anything else. But nonetheless, it was crucial because it demonstrated the degree to which Prigozhin had indeed become a problem for the regime, and why actually this whole story also has longer-term implications. First of all, Prigozhin, increasingly alarmed and indeed angered at what was happening to his boys in the Ukraine war, the degree to which they were being used almost as human ammunition, was beginning to do one of the most dangerous things for an information control autocracy like Putin's. He was telling the truth. And it's quite interesting now that we've actually seen Defense Minister Shoigu finally moved on to a different position, and a series of arrests of corrupt generals. In many ways, actually, Prigozhin's critiques are being demonstrated to have been true. And this is the point, actually. In such a system, there is nothing more dangerous than the truth. More importantly, though, we have this mutiny, which demonstrates that the security forces, frankly, are not really that supportive of Putin. They don't join the mutiny, but most of them are perfectly happy to sit it out and wait and see. And that matters because control of the security forces was always one of the attributes of Putin's regime that we thought were pretty solid. Not quite as solid as before. But then Putin makes a deal, and clearly 2 months later reneges on it when Prigozhin's plane plummets from the sky. And although Putin rather bizarrely seemed to suggest there may have been some cocaine or alcohol-fueled shenanigans with a hand grenade on the plane, in fact it's pretty clear that in fact it was blown out of the air on Putin's orders. Now that really matters because this is the very first time that Putin has made a deal with an insider and then broken it. I mean, he'll break international law, he'll lie to everyone and sundry, But there's always been this understanding, this panyatya, these understandings, like in any criminal gang, that inside the gang, essentially you have to have trust. You have to know that if the boss makes a deal with you, the boss will stick to it. And this is a point when he didn't. And I think for many people, it demonstrates the degree to which, and I wouldn't say many people, I'm talking about many people in Russia, not just outside. It demonstrates the degree to which actually Putin's whole regime, which is after all based on his own personal authority and his capacity to manage the elite, which largely means playing games of divide and rule, to keep them constantly sort of feuding amongst themselves rather than challenging his position, is increasingly looking rather more ramshackle. That Putin himself is no longer the same Putin as 24 years ago when he came to power. Because not only did he fail to appreciate just how dangerous the feud between Prigozhin and Defence Minister Shoigu was becoming, even though people were trying to tell him. And again, he did his classic thing of basically sticking his head in the ground and just hoping that the problem would go away, until it absolutely exploded in his face, if I can mix my metaphors. But then in terms of handling it, he panicked, he gave Prigozhin what in hindsight was too good a deal, and then felt the need pyrotechnically to revoke that deal. And within the Russian elite as a whole, this was actually really quite disturbing. Not only about what it showed about Putin's increasing incapacity to do the one thing that in the past he was actually very good at, which is managing the elite through these games of divide and rule, but also the fact that it demonstrated that they could no longer trust him. They could no longer assume that a deal that was struck would be observed. So I think this is why there is going to be a long-term significance. Putin has, in effect, undermined himself by the way he dealt with Prigozhin. And so although Prigozhin is dead, I don't believe these rumours that it was all, one of his doubles and he's in fact off sipping cocktails in Thailand or whatever. So Prigozhin is dead, but nonetheless his shadow absolutely will continue to fall across Putin's regime. So those are some of the suggestions. I mean, I think it's a book that's designed to be easily readable. There's lots and lots of nice anecdotes and vignettes, many of which haven't seen the light of day before. We spoke to a whole bunch of people, from ex-mercenaries through to political analysts in Moscow and the like. And it's out now. It's out in hardback, as I said, this one. It's out in ebook form, and it's also out in an audiobook that I narrate myself. And we hope you'll find it useful. We hope you'll find it enjoyable. And if you're in the United States, we hope you'll pre-order. Thanks very much.